A blinking beacon on a radar screen can feel intrusive, even annoying, when you're convinced nothing is wrong. That very impulse to dismiss a warning was playing out over the northern Pacific on September 1st, 1983, when a civilian airliner drifted into forbidden skies. A momentary shrug of a warning light would soon echo in headlines around the world. On the surface, it seems almost absurd that a radar alert could go unheeded. Yet, the human brain is wired to protect our existing beliefs above all else. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. When we encounter information that conflicts with our expectations, we unconsciously filter it out. We trust our own map of reality more than the signals flashing on an unfamiliar screen. In that haze of routine and familiarity, even the most serious cautions can slip through. In this case, the story begins with Flight 007, departing Anchorage for Seoul under a midnight sky. An autopilot switch was set to a direct waypoint instead of a compass heading, sending the plane drifting off the plotted course. Alaskan controllers noticed the deviation and tried to catch the crew's attention. They displayed off-course flags on radar, sent text messages, even offered verbal corrections. Each alert came and went unanswered. The pilots remained confident they were on the cleared route, convinced their instruments were infallible. They waved aside the warnings as anomalies. After all, their dashboard indicated blue skies ahead. Back in Moscow, Soviet radar operators watched a high-flying target inch across restricted airspace. They flicked on intercept channels, repeated coded warnings, and ignited flares to hail the unknown intruder. Each signal was met by silence or a response they could not decode. To military minds already primed for confrontation, the silence spoke volumes. This was not a lost airliner, but a hostile reconnaissance aircraft. Within minutes, orders were given to shoot down the phantom threat. 269 souls aboard the plane were lost that night, and a fragile détente between superpowers shattered in an instant. Psychologically, this disaster unfolded at the intersection of several cognitive blind spots. Confirmation bias led the pilots to privilege their own narrative over incoming data. Automation bias tempted them to trust an autopilot setting rather than cross-checking with manual controls. And under the cover of darkness, inattentional blindness dulled their ability to notice repeated alerts. When warnings clash with our internal story, our brain doesn't just hear the signal. It actively rejects it, preferring a coherent illusion to a jagged truth. The fallout reverberated far beyond the victims' families. Outrage swept the globe as cameras captured empty seats on a downed airliner. In Washington, political leaders seized on the tragedy to push for advanced navigational aids. President Reagan opened civilian access to satellite positioning, paving the way for what we now know as global positioning systems. Meanwhile, diplomatic channels froze and thawed as the two superpowers teetered on the brink of retaliation. One ignored warning had remade the landscape of international relations, ushering in a new era of mistrust and technological reliance. Warnings can be easy to ignore. A flashing light feels like noise. A repeated alert becomes background hum. Yet, when we dismiss a warning, we gamble with far more than our own comfort. We gamble with lives and with history. Imagine the course of the Cold War. If that aircraft had turned when told, or if those radar pulses had pierced human stubbornness. Sometimes the smallest flicker on a console carries the weight of destiny. Heed the warning. Question your assumptions. Because in the quiet space between signal and response, the fate of nations can hang in the balance. In the heart of an April night at Reactor 4, a lone warning lamp buzzed quietly on the control panel, its amber glow almost lost among hundreds of dials and gauges. Beside it, operators in blue uniforms leaned forward, faces lit by the cold hum of fluorescent lights. The station's corridors felt unnaturally warm, smelling faintly of hot metal and ozone. Amid this calm, a blip registered on a recorder, a subtle tremor in a machine designed to stay steady. To the team racing the clock on a test, that small warning felt like an inconvenient flicker, an illusion best ignored. For years, the technicians at Chernobyl had learned to treat minor alarms as background noise. Under pressure to meet production targets, they developed a culture of quiet compromise with their own safety systems. A flashing light became a suggestion, not a command. It's easy to view disastrous outcomes as failures of engineering, but the root often lies in human assumptions. We believe our experience makes us experts, even when signals point elsewhere. That misplaced confidence turns warnings into white noise, and white noise into tragedy. This error of omission, ignoring the small, often proves deadlier than any breach of protocol. On the night of April 26, 1986, engineers gathered to run a critical safety test, with the reactor's power levels dropping to near zero before the planned shutdown. They manually disabled emergency core cooling interlocks and bypassed automatic shutdown protocols, convinced they understood every nuance of the reactor's behavior. As the turbines slowed, pressure began to climb unpredictably. The control panel erupted in a chorus of lights and sirens, but the team dismissed them as misleading artifacts. Then, with a deafening blast and a flash brighter than 1,000 suns, the core tore itself apart, hurling radioactive steam into the atmosphere. In that moment, every ignored alert became a testament to a choice: ignore or act. Psychologically, Chernobyl is a masterclass in groupthink and the normalization of deviance. When an entire team quietly accepts a minor rule breach, it becomes the new normal. Over time, each skipped alarm feels justified because no harm followed the last one. In that silence, doubts wither. Laboratories still cite this event when warning about how authority gradients can stifle a lone voice that questions the plan. Cognitive dissonance kicks in. Technicians who once trusted their training now rationalized each dangerous choice. What starts as a pragmatic workaround can spiral into blind acceptance of risk until the machinery finds its own dreadful remedy. Earlier that evening, a junior engineer hesitated to ask a senior to re-enable the scram system, fearing it would derail the test and draw ire from management. The superior brushed off his concern with a wave of the hand, insisting they knew what they were doing. That informal dismissiveness turned a cautionary suggestion into an afterthought. By the time a seasoned inspector arrived, the reactor core was already compromised. Every minute spent on bureaucracy and bravado cost precious warning time. In the blink of an eye, the plant transformed from a marvel of Soviet engineering into an invisible threat that would contaminate landscapes for generations. It's tempting to see Chernobyl as an isolated collapse of Soviet ideology, but the same pattern emerges across industries. Airline pilots who silence radar beeps to stay on schedule. Software developers who override error warnings to meet a launch date. Medical teams who ignore monitor alarms during peak emergencies. Psychologically, we call this tunnel vision under stress. Our minds narrow focus on the task at hand and shut out discordant signals. Meanwhile, authority bias convinces us that directives from leadership outweigh data over the speaker's shoulder. When warnings clash with convenience, convenience often wins. It's a reminder that no system is stronger than the people who operate it. When a faint warning light feels like an annoyance, we risk losing sight of what truly matters. Real safety lives not in flawless designs, but in the humility to pause and listen. Questions wrapped in hesitation are lifelines in disguise. Next time a gauge wavers or an alarm whispers, lean in rather than tune out. Because destiny can hinge on a single flicker of doubt. We owe it to ourselves to treat every caution as a lifeline, not a nuisance. The greatest innovations honor caution as their partner, not their adversary. At dawn, on a frigid January morning in 1986, steam curled from the launch pad as 7 astronauts settled into Challenger's cabin. Beneath that mist, a quiet fear rippled through the team. The critical rubber seals in the rocket's joints stiffen in cold, losing their ability to contain hot gases. Yet, instead of delaying, a decision set the course for disaster. This was not simply a technical oversight. It was a human choice shaped by pressure, habit, and the unseen pull of schedules. Most of us trust that high-stakes calls are made with calm deliberation. We assume experts will pause, weigh risks carefully, and err on the side of safety. But at Cape Canaveral, the intersection of television contracts, political calendars, and a culture that prized timeliness began to drown out lingering doubts. When engineers raised alarms about frozen seals, their concerns were reframed as objections to be managed, not reasons to wait. That shift reveals a sobering truth. Our decisions are driven as much by invisible currents of expectation as by the data before us. The night before launch, a tense teleconference crackled to life. Engineers from the seal manufacturer described how at 0 degrees Fahrenheit the rubber could crack under pressure. They reminded everyone that no prior flight had ever launched in such cold. Managers asked for contingency plans, not a postponement. One engineer hesitated and asked if it was worth the delay. The answer came back firmly: continue as scheduled. Within hours, Challenger roared into the sky. 73 seconds later, the frozen seals failed, flame burst through a joint, and the shuttle broke apart. A broken gasket became a broken promise. Psychologically, this moment is a textbook case of groupthink and confirmation bias. Under relentless deadline pressure, teams too often downplay anomalies. When leaders express certainty, dissenting voices grow silent. Social conformity and fear of being labelled difficult can override the imperative to speak up. Researchers have shown that when ambiguity meets hierarchy, people defer to authority and avoid disrupting consensus, even when human lives hang in the balance. In Challenger's story, these dynamics eclipsed cold facts and ethical judgment. It's easy to imagine we would never let schedule trump safety. Yet, we've all felt moments when saying no seemed too risky. Perhaps at work, you've swallowed a doubt to keep a project on track. Or, in a group, you've gone along to avoid conflict. That quiet concessions can escalate into tragedy is Challenger's legacy. It reminds us that true expertise includes the courage to pause, to question, and to honour the smallest warning. We carry that lesson each time we face a decision. It asks us to listen to the softest caution and give voice to the lone dissent. It invites you to spot hidden assumptions and ask, should we wait? By embracing respectful disagreement and valuing caution over convenience, we build a culture where safety wins and truth prevails. In doing so, we honour the memory of those 7 lives and ensure that tomorrow's choices are wiser than yesterday's. On a calm April night in 1912, the RMS Titanic glided through the icy waters of the North Atlantic, its decks alive with music and laughter. Beneath the star-lit sky, passengers mingled in confidence, believing they were aboard the most advanced ship the world had ever seen. Yet just beyond the bow, a monstrous iceberg lay waiting, its silent form blending with the dark horizon. In that moment, a single misjudgment cast a shadow over the illusion of invincibility. That misjudgment was not a stroke of fate, but a product of human error and overconfidence. The Titanic's designers and crew believed in their creation so fully that they dismissed the danger of ice. Lookouts scanned the night without binoculars. The ship steamed ahead at near full speed, and several wireless ice warnings went unheeded or misunderstood. Psychologically, this collapse of caution stemmed from an illusion of safety, a bias that can lead even the brightest among us to ignore warnings until it is too late. It was a stark reminder that technology alone cannot replace vigilance. On April 14th, the bridge crew received multiple bulletins from nearby ships about drifting ice. Some messages described great fields of ice and icebergs directly in the Titanic's path. Yet the ship maintained a brisk pace of 20 knots, confident that its watertight compartments would hold. In the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee peered into the darkness without binoculars, which were locked away on board another vessel. They spotted an iceberg only when it loomed 600 feet ahead. Captain Smith ordered the wheel hard to port, but with too little time and the turning radius of that giant hull, the iceberg grazed the starboard side. The collision tore open panels below the waterline, sealing a tragic fate. This disaster illustrates how cognitive biases can override even the most rigorous planning. The Titanic's officers fell prey to normalcy bias, assuming that what had not caused harm up to that point never would. They dismissed ice warnings as routine hazards rather than clear threats. Groupthink also played a part. Officers and passengers alike reassured each other that the ship was unsinkable, creating a collective denial of risk. Psychologically, when a group shares an unchallenged belief, dissenting voices grow quiet. And when those in authority express confidence, others inherit that certainty. Meanwhile, the phenomenon of overconfidence bias led the crew to overestimate their ability to maneuver or to repair damage. These mental shortcuts saved time and effort in everyday life, but on that fateful night, they turned a manageable obstacle into an irreversible catastrophe. The legacy of the Titanic iceberg misjudgment reaches far beyond the icy seas. It reminds us how small oversights and shared illusions can cascade into tragedy. In business, ignoring caution signals or dismissing dissent can derail entire ventures. In healthcare, assuming routine procedures pose no harm can endanger patient lives. Even in daily decisions, normalcy bias and overconfidence can blind you to hazards in your path. Psychologically, awareness of these biases is the first step toward prevention. By fostering environments where warnings are heard and questions are welcomed, we invite a culture of humility rather than hubris. When we pause to challenge assumptions and listen to skeptical voices, we build resilience against the unexpected and respect the lessons carved into history's frozen waters. The Titanic's iceberg misjudgment remains a haunting lesson in humility and vigilance. It shows that marvels of engineering cannot shield us from simple human error when we ignore the quiet signals beneath the surface. Yet that same lesson offers hope. By acknowledging our biases and honouring warnings, we turn mistakes into guidance. Every cautious glance, every question asked, and every careful adjustment can steer us away from peril. In honouring the memory of that chilled night, we commit to listening more closely and to tempering confidence with care. Only then can we ensure that history's icy lessons guide us towards safer seas and steadier journeys. In the faint hum of turbines and the shiver of steel pipes deep beneath the Gulf's surface, a single misread gauge set in motion a chain of decisions that would alter the ocean and countless lives. Engineers aboard the rig believed their cement seal held fast. The numbers seemed to promise safety, yet a silent assumption had taken root that small anomalies could be ignored in service of speed and savings. Most of us trust experts with layers of checks and balances. In 2010, on the Deepwater Horizon rig, those layers unravelled in plain sight. Weeks of pressure tests produced conflicting signals. But under pressure from tight deadlines and towering budgets, teams chose the version of reality that felt most convenient. Psychologically, this taps into confirmation bias, where we see what we expect rather than what might be true. Early that April morning, an uneasy crew noted rising pressure in the well. Instead of pausing to re-examine data, they chalked it up to a fluke. It was easier to dismiss the warning than to halt operations and risk cost overruns. This pattern, sometimes called the normalization of deviance, happens when small failures become routine. Over time, our tolerance grows until the next anomaly feels ordinary. A mismatch of responsibilities deepened the problem. BP, Halliburton and Transocean each held pieces of the puzzle, yet no single group bore ultimate accountability. When no one sees the whole picture, critical gaps remain. It's a common blind spot in complex projects, diffusion of responsibility. Each participant assumes another will catch the oversight, but when multiple hands push forward without pause, the wellhead at the seabed became a ticking time bomb. By the time the blowout preventer failed to seal, 11 lives were lost. More than 4 million barrels of oil gushed into the ocean over nearly 3 months, turning waves dark and shores slick. The scale of the spill was unprecedented, a stark reminder that hidden decisions sometimes carry the greatest weight. Empty apologies and post-mortems followed, but words alone cannot replace safety lost beneath the waves. The tragedy exposed how groupthink and plan continuation bias can blind teams to obvious flaws. When momentum builds toward a goal, dissenting voices grow quieter, their concerns buried under layers of optimism. Learning to pause and invite the unpopular question can break that cycle before millions of gallons slip into the sea. Psychologically, cost-cutting measures and tight timetables can warp judgment. When stakes feel distant and abstract, we unconsciously prioritize immediate goals over unseen dangers. It's as if the mind erects a blindfold around the uncomfortable possibilities. In hindsight, only obvious truths remain. But at the moment, complexity can feel like a burden too heavy to bear. Real oversight demands more than checklists and blueprints. It requires cultivating a mindset that welcomes dissent and questions certainty. Experts must feel empowered to speak up when data doesn't align with expectation. Organizations that foster open dialogue guard against the silent slip of complacency. Acknowledging uncertainty isn't a sign of weakness, it's a safeguard against catastrophe. After the Deepwater Horizon disaster, regulators and industry leaders worldwide re-evaluated safety cultures. New protocols emerged to enforce rigorous testing and independent review. Yet the deeper lesson reaches into every human endeavor. Shortcuts may offer speed, but they erode the foundation of trust and security. True diligence lives in the moments we hesitate, double-check, and confront our discomfort. Today, when you hear about complex operations or high-stakes decisions, remember the mirage of progress. Progress that overlooks risk can be an illusion. Genuine oversight listens for the whisper of warning signals, even when they interrupt our urgency. It is not a box to tick, but a living commitment to inspect, question, and learn. In our oversight lies the power to prevent the next tragedy. On a crisp autumn morning in October 1929, a hush fell over Wall Street as the once roaring trading floor fell eerily silent. Ticker tapes that had chattered like sewing machines stuttered to a stop. Brokers froze mid-gesture, eyes glued to wavering numbers that slid from green gains into red losses. Telephone lines buzzed with frantic calls, yet no one had an answer. In that moment, a sense of disbelief swept through every corner of the exchange. This was not a typical downturn. It was a collapse shaped by human miscalculations. Behind the headline, losses lay a bedrock of unchecked optimism. In the roaring 20s, confidence soared higher than stock prices. Everyday people borrowed money on margin, putting down just a fraction of a share's cost and wagering on endless growth. This practice did not just amplify gains, it magnified losses. When share values weakened, brokers issued margin calls demanding cash or collateral. panic selling ensued. What began as a ripple of nervous trades became a tidal wave that overwhelmed the market, proving that greed and leverage can turn opportunity into catastrophe. This crash was more than an economic event. It was a testament to our psychological vulnerabilities. Behavioral scientists describe herd behavior as our instinct to mirror others in uncertain times. Loss aversion made selling losses feel more urgent than capturing gains pleased us. Each frantic order fueled the next, creating a feedback loop of fear. In those chaotic hours, individual judgment yielded to collective panic. What had seemed rational moments before became utterly irrational. The market's tumble reflected not just shifting prices, but the power of groupthink gone awry. Investors also fell victim to the illusion of control, believing they could time the market's highs and lows. They mistook short-term gains for sustainable trends. Prospect theory teaches that losses hit us twice as hard as equivalent gains delight us, and in 1929, that imbalance proved ruinous. Compounding these biases was the gambler's fallacy, the belief that past results guarantee future rewards. As prices plunged, many convinced themselves a rebound was imminent, delaying exits until it was too late. In hindsight, these errors read like a roadmap of human folly. On Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the chaos reached its peak. From dawn, markets reopened with a torrent of sell orders. Billions in paper wealth evaporated as screens flashed crimson. Brokers pleaded for calm, but the tidal wave of orders drowned out reason. Ordinary families watched their life savings shrink before breakfast. Farmers saw fortunes wiped out overnight, and retirees faced an uncertain future. Stories emerged of people leaping from ledges, perhaps legend, perhaps heartbreak made flesh. Each tale underscored how swiftly our hopes can collapse when left unchecked. Out of this wreckage came transformative reforms. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial and investment banking, curbing reckless speculation. The Securities and Exchange Commission was born, tasked with policing market fairness and transparency. Decades later, circuit breakers were introduced to pause trading during extreme swings, giving time for reason to replace panic. These measures were not just bureaucratic fixes, they were built on the lesson that unrestrained human impulses need guardrails. History taught us that systems alone cannot prevail without understanding the forces that drive human behavior. Markets have crashed since then, from the dot-com bubble bursting at the turn of the century to the global downturn in 2008. Each time, human misjudgment played a starring role. In 2008, mortgage mania and belief in ever-rising home prices echoed the margin craziness of 1929. Fear and greed danced their familiar waltz, reminding us that innovation and new financial instruments cannot eliminate our oldest instincts. Recognizing these patterns transforms us from unwitting participants into vigilant observers of our own biases. A stock market crash is never just a fluke of numbers. It is a mirror reflecting our greatest strengths and weaknesses. It reminds us that progress requires humility as much as ambition. By acknowledging our tendencies toward herd mentality, loss aversion, and overconfidence, we gain the wisdom to build safer markets and broader perspectives. The true safeguard is not an algorithm or a regulator. It is our ability to learn from past mistakes. When we heed those lessons, a crash becomes not just a cautionary tale, but a guide toward a more resilient future. In 1971, a compact car rolled off Ford's assembly line, promising to make driving more accessible and efficient. It was called the Pinto, and within months it became the subject of a chilling debate that valued human life in dollar terms. This is a story about a design flaw, a corporate decision, and a moral compromise that reverberated around the world. The Pinto's fuel tank, sat just behind the rear axle, leaving it exposed in rear-end collisions. During internal crash tests, some vehicles ignited on impact, trapping occupants in deadly fires. Engineers recommended adding a steel shield to protect the tank, a simple modification that would have cost about $12 per car. But in a culture obsessed with keeping prices low, that fix never happened. When Ford's executives turned to spreadsheets, they performed a cost-benefit analysis that spelled out every dollar. They estimated the cost of injuries and fatalities, assigning a value of roughly $59,000 per life lost. In their calculations, it was cheaper to pay potential lawsuit settlements than to redesign the car. Numbers won the day. Human beings counted as mere statistics on a balance sheet. That calculation was more than finance. It was a moral disengagement. Psychologists describe it as the process of detaching our moral compass from real consequences when decisions are filtered through abstract metrics. In a conference room lined with executives and engineers, empathy gave way to profit motives. When lives become probabilities, it becomes all too easy to shrug and say, "We followed the numbers." This episode also highlights how cognitive biases distort our sense of risk. A 1 in 10,000 chance of a fiery wreck feels negligible on paper, even though it translates to real people suffering unimaginable harm. When risk is framed in abstract probabilities, decision-makers fail to see the human face behind the flaw. That detachment turns potential prevention into tragic consequence. The results were devastating. Hundreds burned alive in rear impact crashes, and survivors carried scars, both physical and emotional. Families who lost loved ones received settlement checks that felt like cold consolation. When news of the design compromise spilled into the public, nationwide outrage erupted. Ford was forced to recall the Pinto and revise its safety processes, but the damage had already been done. At congressional hearings, executives faced pointed questions from legislators demanding to know how a company could prioritize profits over people. Journalists aired chilling testimony from survivors. Consumer advocates seized the story to push for stricter safety regulations and greater corporate accountability. That pressure transformed the auto industry and set a precedent for how society holds corporations responsible for human cost. In the wake of the Pinto scandal, regulators introduced more rigorous crash testing and fuel system standards. Automakers learned they could no longer treat safety as optional. Vehicles today undergo hundreds of simulations and live tests before they reach showrooms. Every time a car earns a top safety rating or a new airbag system is adopted, we see the legacy of those hard lessons. But the Pinto compromise is not just a historical footnote. It's a warning about everyday choices we all face. Whether setting corporate budgets, negotiating deadlines, or planning personal projects, we must guard against letting abstract metrics eclipse human impact. If we treat people like line items, we risk repeating the same mistake, trading empathy for efficiency until the cost becomes measured in lives. Next time you must make a tough decision, pause to imagine the individuals on the other side of those numbers. Ask yourself, what price can never be paid? How do our choices affect real people? By centering empathy in the decision-making process, we reclaim our moral responsibility and ensure that the human cost never becomes an afterthought. The Ford Pinto compromise stands as one of the most disturbing examples of how a single corporate decision, filtered through cold calculation, can ripple through communities and change laws. Let it remind us that true progress balances ambition with accountability, profit with purpose, and cost with conscience. In every choice we make, may we never forget that empathy is the most valuable metric of all. Imagine looking up at a city skyline painted in a gentle hue, believing the air you breathe is safe. But behind that rosy glow lies a lethal brew of particles that can scar lungs and shorten lives. Smog data concealment is a less obvious catastrophe. It is the quiet act of erasing evidence, of telling communities that the threat they inhale does not exist. Yet by hiding the truth, powerful institutions inflicted harm on millions. This mistake did not unfold in a single night. It grew in boardrooms and press offices, in the white coating of denial that drifted over facts. And when reality finally broke through, the cost was measured in shattered health and broken trust. At its core, smog data concealment is a story of fear and short-term thinking. Governments and industries, worried about stock prices or public outrage, decide that searching for truth is too costly. So they bury readings, delay public advisories, and adjust reporting thresholds. Psychologically, this taps into motivated reasoning, the human tendency to defend our beliefs by ignoring uncomfortable evidence. We prefer to shape data to fit our goals rather than let it reshape our understanding. This pattern plays out in boardrooms, where executives calculate the political fallout of stark numbers, and in press corridors, where headlines are tamed to avoid panic. When air quality monitoring stations report toxic levels, the instinct to silence that warning can feel more convenient than confronting the economic pain of stringent safeguards. Take the famous Great Smog of 1952 in London. For days, a yellowish haze smothered the city. Official reports told you it was just pea soup fog, not coal combustion. Local authorities refused to release accurate measurements of airborne sulfur dioxide and particulates. Newspapers with government ties downplayed mortality statistics. Researchers later estimated that tens of thousands died prematurely as hospitals overflowed and people choked in their homes. By the time you learned the truth, trust was already broken, and a landmark law was required to clean the air. That response sprang not from proactive transparency, but from tragic revelation. Concealment delayed reform until death rates soared, showing how deadly it is to hide scientific reality. More recently, if you check different sources around the world, you might see two versions of the same data. In Beijing, international reports showed hazardous air conditions, while domestic bulletins offered milder assessments. That dual narrative allowed officials to claim progress in pollution control, even as you and your neighbours wore masks and indoor air purifiers hummed. Here, motivated reasoning collided with normalcy bias. Your brain, assuming that because a threat is downplayed, it cannot be severe, but your lungs know better. Chronic exposure to concealed pollution accelerates heart disease, damages cognitive development in children, and even raises the chance of respiratory cancers decades later. Concealing smog data is more than misreporting numbers. It erodes the social contract that binds citizens and their leaders. Trust becomes as polluted as the air. When people learn that data was falsified, they grow skeptical of future warnings, even when they are genuine. Psychologically, trust is hard to rebuild once broken. Communities that feel deceived may ignore valid public health directives, fueling a cycle of disbelief and danger. And the environmental cost multiplies, because delayed action means more factories belch emissions, more cars belch fumes, and delicate ecosystems collapse under a blanket of unseen toxins. The lesson is clear. Transparency is not optional. True stewardship demands that we present data honestly, however alarming it may be. When we shine a light on pollution, we empower communities to safeguard themselves. We give scientists the raw material they need to design effective solutions. We lay the foundation for policy that balances economic vitality with human well-being. Adopting open reporting systems, independent audits, and real-time monitoring creates accountability. And when the air quality index rises, we can trust its warning rather than question its motives. Only by facing the sky's true colour can we clear the air for good. Concealment may delay pain, but revealed truth makes lasting progress possible. The morning I walked past the steel doors of the vaccine laboratory, you could smell the faint tang of antiseptic in the hallway, and the hum of machines felt like a heartbeat for hope. But inside that controlled calm, a tiny misstep was about to ripple out into a wave of fear. Most of us assume that medicine is infallible, that every vial that reaches your arm has been tested 1,000 times over. Yet, sometimes a single oversight can shatter that certainty and compress decades of progress into a moment. In 1955, researchers rushed to distribute a new polio vaccine that held the promise of ending one of the most dreaded diseases of the 20th century. At one laboratory, a batch intended to be inactivated still contained live virus. The mistake went unnoticed until reports of alarming paralysis began to surface among children who received the injections. Panic set in faster than the disease itself. Parents recoiled at the thought that a remedy might carry its own danger. 40 children were paralyzed, some lost their lives, and the broader rollout of the vaccine ground to a halt. What had been celebrated as a triumph of science suddenly felt like a breach of trust, and that sense of betrayal echoed in every doctor's office across the nation. Psychologically, the incident tapped into a deep human vulnerability. When we perceive that our safety depends on someone else's competence, our minds zero in on worst-case scenarios. Fear hijacks reason, and the availability heuristic, our tendency to judge likelihood by how easily examples come to mind, can overshadow the far greater safety record of vaccines overall. Our brains are wired to respond strongly to narrative examples, making it all the harder for data and reassurances to cut through the anxiety. That vaccine contamination scare taught us that quality control isn't just a to-do list, it's a form of care. It showed that redundancy and deliberate checks are not bureaucratic hurdles, but guardians of our collective well-being. Laboratories learned to slow down, to insert extra validation steps before any product could leave the premises, and regulators introduced new protocols that made such an error far less likely. Regulatory agencies worldwide adopted new standards called good manufacturing practice, embedding thorough audits, real-time monitoring, and mandatory fail-safes into every stage of production. These protocols recognize that small errors can magnify when scaled, and that proactive checks save not only lives but trust itself. Today, every batch of vaccine undergoes multiple rounds of inactivation tests, often overseen by independent inspectors around the globe. Synthetic biology techniques, machine learning algorithms, and automated logging ensure that each process step is recorded and verified. This layered approach to safety didn't emerge overnight. It was born from the urgent realization that a single contaminated vial can set back years of medical advancement. Looking back, it's easy to see how close we came to losing faith in vaccines forever. Yet, from that crisis grew a more resilient system, one that understands how fragile trust can be and how essential transparency is to maintaining it. Scientists began to communicate more openly about their methods. Health authorities recognized the power of admitting mistakes rather than concealing them. In the end, the release of that flawed vaccine was a dark chapter in medical history, but it also marked a turning point. It reminded us that vigilance is never optional, that every procedure deserves a moment of pause before we move forward. When we treat safeguards as fundamental rather than optional, we lay a stronger foundation for hope to stand upon. So the next time you roll up your sleeve, remember that behind every dose, there's a chain of people committed to precision, review, and honesty. It's not just a vial you're receiving, it's a promise. And that promise is the legacy of those who turned a near catastrophe into an enduring safeguard for generations to come. Morning broke over the Khumbu icefall, but the usual hum of activity seemed hushed. At 2 o'clock that morning, a team of 16 Sherpa guides shouldered their loads, clipping carabiners and chalking their hands as they made their way up a familiar route toward Camp 1. They had climbed this stretch dozens of times. The icefall was their workplace, not a wilderness. Then came the crack, sharp and sudden, like glass shattering high above. A massive sérac fractured, sending a wall of ice cascading down the slope. In an instant, the mountain claimed 16 lives. That tragedy on the 18th of April, 2014, wasn't just nature's fury. It was the result of choices we made. On Everest, we often treat tradition like a shield against danger. We keep to the same tracks and trust the usual checkpoints. But that morning, our routine blinded us. We ignored the warming temperatures that made the séracs unstable. We believed the route was safe simply because it had been safe before. Psychologically, this is called normalcy bias. Our brains cling to past experience, even when the landscape shifts beneath us. Take a simple moment. A Sherpa guide pauses at the base of a towering ice wall. He glances upward, noting a thin crack threading through the blue ice. He tucks the thought away and continues. We've all done something similar, brushing aside unease when we assume nothing will change. On Everest, that assumption can be fatal. Beyond habit, money and status drive our decisions. Every spring, Everest's permit fees top $70,000, turning the climb into a luxury ticket to the top of the world. Expeditions churn through the icefall with clockwork precision, as if efficiency could substitute for caution. Among the bustle, voices of concern fade into background noise, silenced by groupthink. When everyone nods and moves forward, it becomes harder to speak up against a glaring crack overhead. Psychologically, our reliance on habit dulls awareness. Habituation means we stop reacting to risks we've seen before. When we walked this path every season without incident, we told ourselves it would stay the same. But mountains are alive. Ice moves, temperatures rise, and what was secure can fracture overnight. In the aftermath, Sherpa communities united, halting rope fixing until their safety demands were met. Simultaneously, new regulations shifted how Everest was climbed. Icefall routes rotated more cautiously, and safety teams gained power to delay ascents. Western climbers, moved by solidarity, began listening to Sherpa's expertise, reshaping both policy and respect on the mountain. The Avalanche left an indelible mark. It taught us that no amount of experience can outweigh the need for humility. It reminded us that tradition must bend to reality, and that every warning, no matter how small, deserves attention. The mountain did not forgive our oversight, but it offered a lesson. To move forward, we must let go of complacency. Today, when you find yourself relying on routine, remember the Khumbu icefall. Remember the lives lost to a crack we convinced ourselves would stay closed. Let that moment echo in your own choices. Sometimes the greatest dangers lie not in the unknown, but in the familiar path we travelled without thought. Everest's avalanche was not just snow and ice. It was a mirror reflecting our tendency to trust patterns until they break. And in that break, we find the call to tread more carefully, to listen more closely, and to meet the world with the respect it demands. There's a moment in history where everything changed because of a pause, not a protest, not a gunshot, not a wall crumbling under force, but a pause. It happened on a cool November evening in 1989. East Germany was holding a press conference. A spokesman stood in front of reporters, reading from a statement about travel regulations. It was dry, bureaucratic, and vague, until a reporter asked a simple question. When does this take effect? The spokesman flipped through his notes. He paused, he hesitated, and then he said, "As far as I know, effective immediately." That pause broke a country. Because of that one statement, unprepared, uncertain, and unintended, thousands of East Berliners gathered at the wall that very night. Guards weren't given orders. Leaders weren't ready. But the people were. They started pushing forward, not with weapons, but with hope. And somehow, against decades of division and violence, the gates opened. The Berlin Wall didn't fall with a bang. It collapsed under the weight of confusion. This wasn't part of some master plan. In fact, East German officials had meant to roll out changes gradually with control and documentation. But one slip, one misunderstood policy, triggered one of the most profound moments of the 20th century. It's a strange kind of irony that a regime built on control could be undone by a communication mistake. But there's something deeper here too. We tend to think history is shaped by bold moves and powerful people. And often it is, but sometimes history tilts on something quieter, a misstep, a moment of hesitation, a phrase said too soon or too vaguely. Psychologically, this reminds us how sensitive large systems are to small inputs. In complex systems theory, it's called a tipping point, where things build slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one tiny change sends everything cascading, like the last drop that makes a cup overflow. What's haunting is how human this all was. The man at the microphone wasn't a villain or a hero, just someone doing a job, under pressure, trying to get through a stack of notes. And yet, that moment changed lives, ended careers, reunited families, shifted borders, and eventually helped end the Cold War. It also shows how fragile even the strongest walls can be when they're held up by fear and silence and someone finally speaks. We like to imagine that progress is neat, that justice arrives in speeches and parades, but sometimes it shows up in confusion, in contradiction, in a pause. That's the weight of human mistakes. They don't always ruin. Sometimes they release. And if a single moment of miscommunication can open a border once thought unbreakable, then maybe the things we believe are fixed, impossible, immovable, aren't. They might just be waiting for the right kind of pause. It started with a spark, not in the sky, but in a belief that technology could outpace caution, that speed could outshine safety. In the spring of 1937, the Hindenburg, Germany's pride, a floating giant of ambition, lifted into the sky with the promise of elegance and efficiency. It was massive, majestic, and filled with something invisible. Hydrogen. Hydrogen is the lightest element in the universe. It's abundant, it's efficient, and it's flammable, highly flammable. But that didn't stop engineers from filling the airship with over 7 million cubic feet of it. Because helium, safer, non-flammable helium, was tightly controlled by the United States. So hydrogen, despite the risk, became the choice. Not because it was the best option, but because it was the available one. The Hindenburg wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of progress, of power, of what humans could do when they dared to dream big. But dreams don't float forever. On May 6th, as the airship hovered over a landing field in New Jersey, something went wrong. A spark, a leak, a chain reaction. In under 40 seconds, the sky turned to fire. The images still haunt. Flames swallowing metal, the framework collapsing mid-air, people running, shouting, disappearing into smoke. 36 lives were lost. Not hundreds, not thousands. But it only takes one tragedy, captured so viscerally, to change everything. And it did. For many, the question wasn't just how, but why. Why take such a risk? Why trust something so volatile? In hindsight, the answer seems simple. But at the time, ambition spoke louder than doubt. And ambition often wears confidence like armour, even when it's made of paper. Psychologically, this points to something deeper, our tendency to normalise danger when it becomes familiar. The Hindenburg had made successful flights before. Hydrogen hadn't failed yet, so the danger, once terrifying, began to feel distant. And when risk becomes routine, caution fades. It's a bias called normalcy. We stop questioning what works until it doesn't. And then there's another bias, optimism. We overestimate control. We assume problems are fixable, that failures are flukes, that history won't repeat itself as long as we're the ones in charge. But hydrogen doesn't care who's at the wheel. What's chilling is how common this mindset still is. Different tools, different stakes, but the same mistake. We shortcut safety for speed. We trust systems we barely understand. We assume failure won't find us. Until it does. In a factory, on a trading floor, in a line of code, or mid-air. The Hindenburg wasn't just a disaster, it was a mirror. It showed us the price of ignoring invisible risks, the cost of overconfidence, and how quickly awe can turn to horror when our best ideas forget their limits. Sometimes it takes only seconds for history to reroute. But the signs often come long before the fire. And the lesson is never just in the crash, it's in the choices that led us there. It didn't start with sirens or a shout. It began with a rumble, distant and deep. And then the ocean moved in a way it never should. That day, March 11th, 2011, the Earth shifted beneath Japan's Pacific coast. Minutes later, the sea followed with devastating intent. The tsunami didn't knock politely. It tore through towns with waves taller than houses, wiping away roads, power lines, and lives in moments. In Fukushima, it did something more. It knocked out the cooling systems at the Dike nuclear plant. And suddenly, this wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a man-made one too. Because here's the truth that hurts. The tsunami was an act of nature. But the meltdown wasn't. That part could have been different. For years, reports had warned that the plant's seawall wasn't high enough, that the backup generators were too vulnerable, that the cooling systems depended too much on power that could easily fail. Yet the warnings sat in drawers, unread or ignored, because they didn't feel urgent until they did. When the water surged in, it drowned the diesel generators. Without them, the reactors overheated. Hydrogen built up. Explosions followed, radiation leaked, and then the world watched in horror as a nuclear crisis unfolded in real time. This wasn't about bad people or a single reckless decision. It was about delay, disbelief, the quiet comfort of thinking, it probably won't happen. Psychologically, it's called normalcy bias, the tendency to underestimate both the likelihood and impact of a disaster, because it hasn't happened yet. And in high-stakes systems, that bias is dangerous. But here's the hard part. Once the damage is done, what's left is not just clean-up, it's accountability. It's trying to protect people while not fully knowing what they've been exposed to. It's farmers discarding crops from irradiated soil, families moving away from homes they'll never return to, children monitored for thyroid issues long after the media has moved on. Still, among the rubble and radiation, something else emerged: resilience. The engineers who stayed behind, risking their health to stabilize the plant. The communities that rebuilt, even with grief in their bones. The global conversations that followed, reshaping nuclear policies from Germany to Taiwan. But resilience shouldn't be the first plan. It should be the backup. The goal should always be prevention. Because at its core, the Fukushima crisis wasn't just a technological failure. It was a human one. A failure to prepare, to listen, to believe the worst could happen, and act before it did. And maybe that's the real lesson. That when the stakes are this high, silence is not safety. Comfort is not a strategy. And waiting until it's urgent is already too late. It wasn't a dramatic explosion or a headline-grabbing disaster. It was a decimal point. A small sensor inside a spacecraft, tasked with measuring oxygen levels, began reporting odd data. Numbers that didn't make sense. Slightly too low, then briefly too high, just enough to raise an eyebrow, but not enough to trigger alarms. At first, engineers thought it was a calibration issue, maybe a software glitch. They recalibrated, restarted systems, ran simulations, and still the numbers danced slightly out of sync with reality. What they didn't know, what no one knew until it was too late, was that the sensor wasn't broken. It was wired backwards. A polarity error so minor it escaped multiple rounds of inspection. But in a closed-loop life support system, a misread of oxygen levels isn't just a mistake, it's a time bomb. Inside the spacecraft, life was carrying on. Conversations, experiments, daily routines, trusting, as we all do, that the data guiding those routines was solid, that behind every number was a team, a system, a safeguard. But the problem with safeguards is that they're only as good as the assumptions behind them. And in this case, the assumption was that the sensor was telling the truth. By the time oxygen levels dropped dangerously low, confusion set in. The crew felt off, foggy, tired. They increased oxygen output, trusting the system to deliver, but the system believed the oxygen was already high, because the sensor, installed backwards, was feeding it lies. The deeper issue wasn't just a single error, it was the psychology behind the response. Confirmation bias, a reluctance to believe something was fundamentally wrong. Human nature to fix symptoms rather than question the diagnosis. We want systems to be reliable, so when something feels off, we often trust the system over our own instincts. Psychologically, this mirrors a broader tendency. When feedback contradicts expectation, we rationalize. We look for reasons why the data must be wrong, instead of considering that our understanding might be incomplete. In engineering, as in life, that moment of hesitation can cost dearly. In the aftermath, investigations traced the error back to a single connector, a simple wire placed the wrong way. But the real lesson wasn't technical, it was human. It was about humility, about how even the most brilliant minds in the most rigorous environments can miss what's right in front of them when they assume the system is smarter than they are. This isn't just a story about space. It's a story about trust. Trust in tools, trust in processes, and ultimately trust in ourselves to question them when something feels off. Because sometimes it's not about needing more data. It's about listening to the discomfort, the nagging doubt, the whisper that says, "Look again." Mistakes like this don't happen because people are careless. They happen because people care deeply. They trust deeply. And that trust can sometimes blind us to the possibility that the smallest piece, barely visible, can tilt an entire mission off course. The sensor was fixed. The systems were redesigned, protocols updated. But the real fix came later, in the shift of mindset, a deeper appreciation for human fallibility, a willingness to double-check the things that seem too small to matter. Because in environments where precision means survival, nothing is too small to matter. It's a humbling reminder. The world doesn't always fall apart in big, visible ways. Sometimes it shifts quietly, one unnoticed wire at a time. It started with a single wrong input, not malicious, not even careless, just off by a few degrees, a subtle shift in coordinates buried in a sea of technical data. And yet, it was enough to send a submarine, one of the most advanced machines ever built, straight into the sea floor. Submarine navigation errors are haunting because they don't unfold in chaos. They unfold in silence, in the hum of instruments, the rhythm of protocol, and the quiet confidence that everything is going as planned until it isn't. There's a psychological concept called automation bias. It describes our tendency to trust systems, especially complex ones, more than we trust ourselves. In high-stakes environments like nuclear submarines or air traffic control, people often defer to the machine. If the GPS says you're in safe waters, it must be true, right? But the ocean doesn't care about our assumptions. It only responds to what VERM is. One of the most tragic examples of this was the USS San Francisco in 2005. A seasoned crew, a fully operational submarine, and a navigation system that didn't account for one crucial detail, an underwater mountain. It struck that mountain at full speed. The impact was catastrophic. One sailor died. Dozens were injured, and it all came down to a chart that hadn't been updated. That's the part that stings the most. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't sabotage. It was a document. A simple oversight that was never meant to reach the surface, but did. And this isn't just about submarines. This is about the quiet moments where confidence drifts into complacency, where systems do the thinking for us, where people stop asking, does this feel right? And start assuming that if no alarm is ringing, everything must be fine. Psychologically, when we work in high-pressure, high-reliability environments, our brains crave shortcuts. We rely on procedures, checklists, routines, all of which are designed to keep us safe. But those same tools can also dull our attention if we stop questioning them. That's the paradox. The very structure that protects us can also blind us. This is why in aviation, in medicine, in military operations, there's a principle drilled in over and over. Trust, but verify. It's not paranoia, it's discipline. A habit of thought that says, even if the numbers line up, I'm still going to double check. Because sometimes it's not the loud mistakes that do the most damage. It's the quiet ones, the ones that pass unnoticed, the ones that live inside a false sense of certainty. And maybe that's the deeper takeaway. That human error isn't always about recklessness or ignorance. Sometimes it's about trust, misplaced, unexamined or automatic. It's about how even the sharpest minds can drift when surrounded by systems that seem infallible. So we build new protocols, we add more checks, we teach awareness, but at the heart of it all, there's still a person reading a screen, interpreting a chart, making a call. And that person matters. Because in the silence before impact, it's not the technology that speaks last, it's us. They buried it in metal drums, sealed and stacked in shallow pits. The idea was containment, but containment, it turns out, doesn't last as long as radiation. One of the most disturbing mistakes humanity has made wasn't creating nuclear energy. It was assuming we knew how to manage its aftermath. In the rush to harness atomic power, safety plans were often improvised. Short-term fixes were disguised as permanent solutions, and what couldn't be seen was too easy to ignore. Take Hanford, Washington, once a crown jewel of America's nuclear weapons program, now one of the most contaminated sites in the Western Hemisphere. Underground tanks there hold over 50 million gallons of radioactive waste. Many of them have leaked. Some still are. Decades later, engineers are still trying to stop what was never fully planned for. Or consider the waste buried in the Irish Sea. Between the 1950s and 1980s, radioactive material was dumped into the ocean with little regard for the long-term consequences. It was legal, it was controlled, but it was also irreversible. Psychologically, this kind of decision-making reflects a bias called temporal discounting. We tend to value immediate benefits over long-term consequences. If something solves the problem today, we convince ourselves tomorrow will sort itself out. But with nuclear waste, tomorrow can last tens of thousands of years. What makes this mistake uniquely haunting is its invisibility. There's no flashing red light, no urgent alarm, just the slow seep of danger into soil, water, and time. Communities near these sites often didn't know the risks until illness began to surface. And by then, the waste was already woven into the ecosystem. Cleanup isn't measured in months, it's measured in generations. There's also a concept in psychology known as moral distancing. It's easier to rationalize harm when we don't see its effects up close. When the damage is buried or delayed, it feels less urgent, less personal. That's how these decisions were made, in boardrooms, in labs, behind layers of abstraction. Not out of malice, but from a belief that science would always find a way to fix what was broken. And science has done remarkable things. But not everything can be reversed. Some waste is so dangerous it must be isolated for longer than civilization has existed. The question isn't just how to store it, it's how to remember it. Because a warning sign today might not mean anything to someone 10,000 years from now. This is what makes nuclear waste mismanagement so sobering. It's not just a failure of engineering, it's a failure of humility, A reminder that just because we can build something doesn't mean we've thought through the full cost of doing so. But there's a deeper lesson here too, one that applies far beyond radioactive waste. It's the need to plan for consequences we may never see, to care about futures we won't live through. In psychology, this capacity is tied to empathy and foresight, two traits that define mature decision-making. When we act without thinking long-term, we may never feel the damage ourselves, but someone will. And if history has shown us anything, it's that those mistakes don't disappear. They just sink a little deeper. Quiet, persistent, waiting to be unearthed again. So maybe the real legacy of nuclear waste isn't just the contamination. It's the question it leaves behind. What are we choosing to bury simply because we don't want to face it now? And who will have to dig it up later? It didn't start with a crime. It started with an idea, an ambition, a belief that numbers could be shaped to tell a better story. And for a while that story worked until it didn't. At the height of its power, Enron was celebrated. A darling of Wall Street. It wasn't just an energy company, it was innovation, risk-taking, genius, or so it seemed, because behind the soaring stock price was a structure made of shadows. Earnings were promised, not earned. Losses were hidden, not owned. And confidence? It was borrowed, bought, and eventually betrayed. This wasn't just accounting fraud, it was a psychological experiment in trust, a test of how long perception could outweigh reality. For years it passed. Executives built shell companies designed to hide debt and inflate profits. They even gave them names: LJM, Raptor, Y2K, entities created not to serve customers, but to serve illusions. Here's what that looked like in real life. Imagine a business tells the world it made $100 million. That sounds impressive. But the truth? It lost twice that. It just moved the losses off its books, tucked them away in these side companies while spotlighting only the good. Analysts cheered, investors bought in, employees poured retirement savings into stock they believed in. No one questioned too hard, because when something looks like a miracle, you want to believe in it. Psychologically, this plays on what researchers call confirmation bias. Once people see success, they look for reasons to justify it. They ignore red flags, doubts feel disloyal. And the louder the celebration, the harder it becomes to question the foundation it stands on. But truth doesn't disappear. It waits, and eventually it's surfaced. A single article, a few probing questions, then collapse. Enron filed for what was, at the time, the largest bankruptcy in US history. Thousands lost jobs. Lifelong savings evaporated. Trust in corporate America cracked. And the most disturbing part, the smartest people in the room didn't miss the warning signs. They made them. They told themselves a story so many times they started to believe it. That what they were doing wasn't wrong. It was clever, legal, necessary. They weren't cheating. They were just getting ahead. This is what makes the Enron story so haunting. It wasn't a tale of evil masterminds. It was a slow, collective drift. A series of choices that felt small in the moment, but massive in hindsight. A culture that praised results, but ignored how they were made. In behavioral science, there's a term for this: moral disengagement. The process by which people convince themselves their actions aren't unethical, just misunderstood. It's not about one big lie. It's about 1,000 small justifications strung together until they look like strategy. And that's the caution buried deep in this history. That human systems, even the most brilliant, the most ambitious, are still built by people. And people are capable of shaping reality to fit their hopes until the truth breaks through. Enron didn't fail because of one decision. It failed because the story stopped matching the facts and no one wanted to look. The lesson isn't just about finance. It's about what happens when we chase outcomes and abandon integrity. What made Enron possible wasn't just greed. It was the silence around it, the applause, the willful suspension of disbelief. And that's what makes mistakes like these so dangerous. They're not always made in secret. Sometimes they're made in plain sight, while everyone watches and claps. They had it. Long before the world knew it needed it, they had it. In 1975, a Kodak engineer named Steve Sasson built something that would quietly alter the course of history, a digital camera. It was clunky, the resolution laughable by today's standards, but it worked. He showed it to the higher-ups, thinking it would spark a revolution. But what it sparked was fear, not of the technology itself, but of what it would mean. Kodak was the king of film, and this new invention. It didn't need film at all. Executives worried it would cannibalize their core business. So instead of running toward the future, they shelved it, hid it, treated it like a threat instead of a breakthrough. This is the part that sticks. Because Kodak didn't fail to innovate. They failed to let go. Psychologically, it's a pattern with a name: loss aversion. We're wired to protect what we already have, even if holding on means missing out. The brain reacts more strongly to potential losses than equivalent gains. It's why we stay in comfortable jobs that don't fulfill us, or hesitate to change paths, even when the signs are clear. We fear the unknown more than we value possibility. Kodak had the chance to lead the digital wave. Instead, they clung to film while others raced ahead. By the time they tried to catch up, it was too late. And this isn't just a business story, it's a human one. Because we all face moments like this, in our careers, relationships, ideas, where we sense something shifting, a new way forward, but it asks something from us first, to loosen our grip on what used to work. That doesn't come easy. Familiar routines feel safe, even when they're quietly becoming obsolete. And change, real change, rarely feels comfortable at the start. It often arrives disguised as disruption or risk or even failure. But here's the deeper truth. Sometimes the bigger mistake isn't in trying and failing. It's in recognizing a better path and doing nothing. Imagine if Kodak had leaned in. If they'd said, this might threaten what we've built, but it could also be the future. That kind of decision takes vision, yes, but also courage. The kind that values adaptability over legacy. Because legacy without evolution becomes irrelevance. And it's not just companies that fade. Ideas fade. Talents fade. Even relationships can fade if we're not willing to let them grow into new forms. What stays alive is what's allowed to adapt. Kodak's story isn't about technology. It's about mindset. About the cost of clinging too tightly to what once made us successful. About what we might lose, not just in profit but in possibility, when we choose safety over vision. So when the next decision comes, the one that feels risky, inconvenient, even a little threatening, it's worth asking, what are we actually afraid of losing? And what future might we miss by standing still? Because sometimes the biggest shift is already in your hands. You just have to choose not to hide it. It starts with a whisper, a few cases, a distant threat, something happening somewhere else. And then suddenly it isn't far away anymore. It's in your town, your street, your home. The spread of a pandemic is rarely a surprise to those who study them. What's surprising is how often we, as a society, ignore the signs, delay action, downplay risks. Even when the science is clear, the timeline predictable, the stakes as high as life and death, the response can be slow, fragmented, or worse, dismissive. This isn't just about one virus or one moment in history. It's about a repeated human pattern, a tendency to overlook danger until it becomes disaster. At the heart of it is a form of psychological bias known as normalcy bias. It's our brain's way of clinging to the familiar, assuming tomorrow will look like yesterday, even when the evidence says otherwise. This bias keeps people calm in crises, but it also makes early warnings feel exaggerated. It tells us this can't be that serious until it is. You've seen it before. Leaders hesitating to act, crowds gathering despite warnings, hospitals running out of space, while officials assure the public there's no need to worry. One real-world example comes from the early stages of a global outbreak. Health officials raised alarms. Data models showed exponential growth. And still, borders stayed open. Testing was limited. And protective equipment was stockpiled too late. The result wasn't just overwhelmed healthcare systems, it was grief. On a scale most people never imagined. Psychologically, this kind of neglect often isn't rooted in cruelty. It's rooted in discomfort. People resist the idea of radical change, even when it's necessary. Leaders fear causing panic. Individuals fear being the only one reacting. So we wait for more proof, more cases, more urgency. And by then, we've lost the window where early action could have saved lives. This delay doesn't just cost time, it costs trust. When communities see those in charge minimizing a threat, it sends a message. Your fear isn't valid. Your safety isn't the priority. That disconnect can linger long after the virus fades. But the lesson here isn't just about failure, it's also about responsibility. In behavioral science, there's a principle called diffusion of responsibility. The more people share a risk, the more likely each person is to assume someone else will step up. That's why pandemics test more than just medicine. They test cooperation, coordination, courage. And maybe the most courageous thing is to take action before it feels necessary. To treat warnings like opportunities, not inconveniences, to trust data over comfort, and to lead with the kind of urgency that doesn't wait for the worst to arrive. Because the cost of waiting isn't always visible at first. It doesn't show up in bold headlines or sharp spikes. Sometimes it shows up quietly, in empty chairs, in silenced laughter, in stories that never got to unfold. And so, the next time the whisper starts, maybe we remember what delay can do. And maybe this time, we choose not to wait. A pause, a shrug, a sigh that barely makes it to the surface. Sometimes the deepest misunderstandings don't come from what's said, but from what's left unsaid. Silent communication happens all the time. It lives in glances, gestures, the space between responses. And when it works, it can feel almost magical. A partner senses your mood without words. A friend knows when to stay. A co-worker offers help without asking. But when it breaks down, the damage isn't just quiet, it's confusing, lingering, and often unnoticed until it's too late. The mistake isn't always malice, it's usually assumption. We assume someone knows how we feel, that they should get it, that if we're not saying it, it's obvious. But here's the problem. Silence isn't a shared language. It's a projection screen. One where we each cast our own version of the story. Take a moment most people have lived. A close friend drifts away. You start replying slower. They do too. You both say you're just busy, but beneath it is something unsaid. Hurt, resentment, misalignment. Nobody names it, so the silence grows roots. And soon, there's no easy path back. It didn't blow up. It just faded out, word by word, pause by pause. Psychologically, this is tied to what researchers call ambiguous loss. The kind of grief that comes without clarity or closure. When someone is emotionally absent, but physically present, or when a bond dissolves without explanation, it leaves us spinning. The brain seeks patterns, the heart wants reason. But in the absence of language, we fill the gaps with fear. Did I do something wrong? Do they even care? And without feedback, those imagined answers harden into belief. The tragedy is, it's often avoidable. Silent breakdowns usually start small. Unspoken discomfort, a misread cue, a withheld apology. They escalate not because of malice, but because no one interrupts the pattern, because it feels safer to say nothing than to risk saying the wrong thing. But safety isn't always found in silence. In fact, the longer the quiet stretches, the louder the meaninglessness feels. And eventually, someone gives up trying to decode it. There's a principle in communication theory known as meta-communication. Not just what we say, but what we say about how we're saying it. It's the difference between arguing and saying, "This feels hard to talk about, but I want to get it right." It's the moment when you interrupt a spiral, not by changing your message, but by explaining your intent. Imagine a relationship where someone says, "When you go quiet, I assume you're upset." That one sentence breaks the loop. It creates a window. Maybe the silence wasn't anger. Maybe it was anxiety or distraction, or simply not knowing what to say. Either way, now it's open, now it's shared. That's the power of turning silent assumptions into voiced understanding. It's tempting to believe that the people who love us should just know. But real connection isn't built on mind reading, it's built on repair, on clarification, on being willing to say, "I noticed a distance and I don't want to guess why." Silent communication will always be part of how humans connect, but it should never be the only part. Because when we rely on it too heavily, we don't just lose clarity, we lose each other. Breakdowns happen in the quiet, but so do breakthroughs. All it takes is one moment of courage, one sentence, one effort to make the invisible visible. That's where understanding begins again. People were stockpiling canned goods, buying generators, cancelling vacations. Some were even pulling their money out of banks, convinced they'd wake up to a world without electricity, communication, or functioning economies. All because of a 2-digit date. It sounds almost absurd now, how the number 00 at the turn of the millennium triggered such widespread alarm. But that was the heart of the Y2K panic. A fear that computers, reading 00 as 1900 instead of 2000, would crash. Planes would fall. Power grids would fail. Life as we knew it could unravel. And here's the strange part. The problem was real. In the early days of programming, computer memory was limited and expensive. So developers saved space by shortening years to just 2 digits. 1987 became 87, harmless at the time. But as the year 2000 crept closer, that shortcut started to look more like a ticking time bomb. Governments, corporations, and tech teams scrambled. Billions of dollars were spent. Systems were tested, patched, and replaced. Code was combed through line by line. There were emergency plans, backup plans, and then backups for the backups. And when the clock struck midnight, something anticlimactic happened. Nothing. Planes stayed in the air, power grids hummed along, the world kept turning, and just like that, the panic became punchline. People scoffed, called it overblown, an expensive non-event, but it's worth asking, was it an overreaction? Or was it prevention working so well we forgot what we were trying to prevent? Psychologically, this taps into a common pattern. When disaster is averted, the fear often looks foolish in hindsight. It's called hindsight bias. We revise our memory of risk because the worst didn't happen. But that's like fixing a leaking roof and then blaming the contractor when your house doesn't flood. The Y2K effort wasn't wasted. It was a global rehearsal in risk management, in how we respond to invisible threats. And it revealed something deeper about us, our relationship with uncertainty. Because uncertainty doesn't feel like an empty space. It feels like danger. When something is unknown, the brain fills in the blanks, often with worst-case scenarios. The more ambiguous the threat, the louder the imagination gets. That's why the Y2K fears snowballed so quickly. It wasn't just about code, it was about control, or the fear of losing it. We like to believe we've moved past that kind of collective overreaction, that we've become more rational, more informed. But the truth is, our brains haven't changed that much. We're still vulnerable to spirals of speculation when faced with the unknown, whether it's a new virus, an economic shift, or a digital glitch. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that people overreacted, but that people cared. That when faced with uncertainty, millions chose preparation over passivity, even if it was messy, even if it was loud. Sometimes the scariest threats are the ones that never arrive. And sometimes the best proof of success is when nothing happens at all. They warned us. Over and over, from behind podiums, inside research labs, through graphs and satellite images, they warned us. But many of those warnings were quietly shelved, buried under politics, economics, and the comforting illusion that we had more time. Ignored climate reports aren't just paperwork. They're snapshots of foresight, of scientists staying up late to model possibilities, of data pointing to rising oceans, shrinking glaciers, vanishing species. They weren't guesses. They were forecasts, ones we had the power to act on. Take the year 1988. A NASA scientist named James Hansen stood before Congress and declared with confidence that global warming wasn't a future theory. It was already happening. He wasn't alone. Decades of research had already shown the same. But the response? Partial attention, short bursts of concern. Then the world moved on. Psychologically, this is what's known as temporal discounting. Our tendency to downplay future consequences when making decisions in the present. We're wired to respond to what's urgent, not what's important. And climate change, for much of its early warning period, felt distant, abstract, easy to postpone. But the irony is, those distant effects are here now. Heat waves are breaking records every summer. Floods, fires, storms, all more intense, more frequent. Ecosystems are unraveling in plain sight. And with each new disaster, those old reports echo a little louder, not with arrogance, but grief. They weren't just right, they were ignored. This isn't just about governments or corporations. It's about a collective habit, how we filter out discomfort, how we prefer short-term ease over long-term planning. It's about how easy it is to minimize what feels too big to solve. And yet, buried in those reports wasn't just doom. There were solutions too. Renewable energy pathways, conservation strategies, emissions targets that could have bent the curve, that still can. Because while the worst predictions may be unfolding, the future is not a fixed outcome. It's still being shaped every single day by what we choose to notice, to act on, to prioritize. In behavioral science, there's a principle called the availability heuristic. We judge the importance of something based on how easily we can recall examples of it. And for a long time, the climate crisis lacked those vivid cues. Now, tragically, we have them. They're no longer projections, they're personal. The choice isn't between hope and despair. It's between numbing ourselves to what we see or turning that recognition into momentum. We don't have the luxury of pretending the storm is far away anymore, but we still have agency in how we respond to it. And maybe that's what those early reports were really asking of us. Not perfection, just courage, just enough imagination to believe that knowing in advance means we can change the story before it's over. It was supposed to mark the hour, a symbol of precision, a clock that thousands of people gathered to watch every day. But for centuries, the astronomical clock in Prague, one of the oldest working clocks in the world, has been wrong. Not a little wrong, wildly wrong. The minute hand, it didn't even exist when the clock was first installed. And the time it showed, that wasn't the time people live by. Because the Prague Orloj wasn't just a timekeeper. It was a statement, a cosmic model of the universe, a monument to human ambition. But here's the strange part. That ambition came with a flaw, a mistake woven into the very gears that still tick today. The clock was calibrated to a cosmological model that didn't reflect reality. And instead of fixing it, the error became tradition. The miscalibration was passed down through generations, admired rather than questioned. It sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? A city synchronized not to truth, but to an illusion. But beneath that poetry lies a deeper lesson. Because when we anchor ourselves to a symbol, when we cling to tradition without re-examination, we risk inheriting not just its beauty, but its blind spots too. In psychology, this is known as functional fixedness. The idea that once we assign a function or a meaning to something, we stop questioning it. A tool becomes only a hammer, a clock becomes only a landmark, and a mistake becomes sacred. We see it in old systems that no longer serve, in rituals that once had reason but now just persist, in institutions and ideas that go unchallenged, not because they work, but because they've always been there. Let's take a more relatable example. Imagine you're part of a workplace where meetings always start at 9. No one remembers why. Maybe it made sense once, but now people are rushed, distracted, juggling school drop-offs or time zones. Still, the calendar stays the same, because that's how it's always been. Or think about family dynamics. Roles silently assigned and never reviewed. The sibling who always plans the holidays. The parent who never asks for help. Patterns that become rules long after they've stopped being fair or true. When we stop asking why, we start living by default. And the truth is, human history is full of clocks like Prague's, beautiful, impressive, deeply flawed and still ticking. But here's the thing, recognizing the flaw doesn't mean tearing the whole thing down. It means understanding what it was meant to represent and asking whether it still does. Sometimes the most powerful act isn't invention, it's revision. It's saying, this has value, but does it still serve us? It's being willing to respect the past without being trapped by it. Because in the end, mistakes don't just change history when they happen. They change it when we stop noticing them. So maybe the Prague clock isn't just a tourist attraction. Maybe it's a mirror. A reminder that what we admire can still be inaccurate. That beauty can hide error. And that wisdom lies in knowing the difference. It doesn't always begin with a flood. Sometimes it begins with a meeting that never happened, a phone call that was postponed, a maintenance checklist that got shuffled to the bottom of the pile. The warning signs were there, but people looked past them, or assumed someone else would handle it. And that's often how disaster creeps in. Not in chaos, but in quiet neglect. In the Netherlands, where the land sits below sea level, dikes are not suggestions, they're survival. They hold back the sea, hour by hour, year after year. But in the winter of 1953, a series of small oversights, scattered decisions, and ignored repairs lined up with a powerful storm. The North Sea surged, the dikes cracked, and eventually they broke. It was one of the deadliest floods in modern European history. Thousands of lives lost. Entire communities swept away. And not just because the sea was strong, but because the system meant to stop it had been left vulnerable for too long. Neglect isn't always dramatic. It doesn't always look like someone doing something wrong. Often, it's just nothing. No action, no urgency, no one feeling truly responsible. That's part of what makes it so dangerous. It feels passive, even harmless, right up until the moment it isn't. In psychology, this kind of systemic failure has a name: diffusion of responsibility. It's the idea that when many people share a task, each person feels less accountable. You assume someone else will notice the crack in the wall. Someone else will double-check the floodgate. Someone else will sound the alarm. But if everyone assumes the same thing, no one acts. And nature doesn't wait. What makes this even harder is that in the moment, doing nothing can feel safe. Fixing a dike costs money. Scheduling inspections takes time. Raising concerns might make waves, so the default becomes delay. We convince ourselves that because it hasn't failed yet, it probably won't, until it does. And this isn't just about infrastructure. The same dynamic shows up in families, workplaces, even friendships. A tension builds, a need goes unmet, a silence grows, but because no one wants to be the first to name it, it lingers. We tell ourselves it's not urgent. We'll bring it up next week, but the longer the breach is ignored, the harder it is to repair. What the Dutch flood teaches us, beyond the statistics and damage, is a deeper truth about how humans handle risk. We're not wired to stay vigilant forever. We adapt, we normalize, we get comfortable. And when something is working just well enough, we assume it'll keep working. But strength doesn't last without attention. Systems don't hold without care. After the flood, the Netherlands didn't just rebuild, they changed the way they thought about prevention. They invested in constant monitoring, in engineering redundancies, in a culture of accountability. The Delta works are one of the most advanced flood protection systems in the world, rose from the wreckage, not just as a response to nature, but to human nature, because that's the real lesson. Disasters like these are rarely just natural, they're human too, made possible by choices, habits and moments where action was just a little too late. Neglect doesn't always look like danger. Sometimes it looks like calm, but underneath that stillness, something is shifting. And unless someone steps up, unless someone takes the small, unglamorous step to check, to fix, to speak up, the breach always finds a way. It wasn't a sophisticated hack. It wasn't a line of malicious code or some elite criminal mastermind tapping away in a basement. It was someone forgetting to follow a simple protocol. One overlooked rule, one unchecked box, and a door was left wide open. That's the unsettling part. Some of the worst cybersecurity breaches in history weren't caused by brilliance, they were caused by human error. And it's easy to shake our heads at those stories, to wonder how someone could be so careless. But the truth is, it's rarely about carelessness, it's about patterns, habits, the kind of routine familiarity that dulls our attention over time. In psychology, this is known as inattentional blindness. When we do something over and over, logging in, clicking through, approving requests, our brain starts to tune out what feels routine. We miss things, not because we're lazy, but because we've learned to stop seeing them. It's the same reason we can drive a familiar route and not remember the trip. Familiarity makes us efficient, but it also makes us vulnerable. Take a simple example. An employee gets an email from their boss, marked urgent. It asks them to send a report, fast. The email looks real, the name matches, they comply. But it wasn't their boss, it was a spoof. A tiny red flag, an odd phrase, a missing signature was there, but it got overlooked. Why? Because urgency narrows our attention. Because the brain prioritizes speed over scrutiny when it thinks it knows what's happening. And this isn't just about email. It's about passwords written on sticky notes, software updates postponed again and again, sensitive documents left open on shared screens, each moment small. Each decision reasonable in isolation, but over time they stack. They create cracks in the system that no firewall can patch. Psychologically, these lapses aren't just technical, they're emotional. People often skip protocols not out of malice, but because they feel overwhelmed. Because following every rule can feel like friction in an already stressful day. When security feels like a barrier instead of a support, people start cutting corners, and those corners are where risk lives. This is why strong cybersecurity isn't just about tech, it's about culture, it's about designing systems that work with human behavior, not against it. Reminders that are timely, not annoying. Training that respects people's time and intelligence. Processes that assume mistakes will happen, and plan for recovery when they do. And when someone does make a mistake, how we respond matters. Shame and blame might feel justified, but they don't build vigilance. They build silence. If people are afraid to admit they clicked something they shouldn't have, the problem doesn't stop, it just goes underground. What keeps systems safe is awareness paired with empathy. A mindset that says, yes, mistakes happen, but they're only dangerous if we don't learn from them. So we check twice, we ask when we're unsure, and we create space for people to do the right thing, even when it takes a little longer. Because the truth is, most breaches don't start with a hacker. They start with a moment. One email, one link, one lapse. And the only real protection is paying attention before that moment arrives. For years, it was just the way things were. You saw old buildings with cracking paint and didn't think twice. Kids played in front yards, scraped knees on porches, maybe chewed on a painted windowsill while teething. No one imagined that something so common could be dangerous. After all, it was just paint, but that assumption, harmless paint, safe homes, was one of the most quietly devastating mistakes in modern history. The lead paint assumption wasn't a single decision. It was a chain reaction of blind spots, convenience, and denial. For most of the 20th century, lead was added to paint to make it dry faster, resist moisture, and last longer. It worked brilliantly. And for manufacturers, that was enough. Even when early warnings emerged, doctors noticing children with developmental issues, researchers linking lead exposure to behavior changes, it was easier to doubt than to disrupt. Easy to say, there's no proof yet, instead of asking, what if we're wrong? It was paint, after all, not poison. But inside those beautifully coated walls, a slow crisis was unfolding. Children in older homes started to show signs of cognitive delays, aggression, trouble in school. And still, for years, the connection wasn't officially recognized. It didn't look like a disaster. There were no explosions, no headlines screaming tragedy, just families struggling quietly, often blamed for what they didn't understand. Psychologically, this mistake shows how dangerous assumptions can be, especially when they feel ordinary. It taps into what's called normalcy bias, our brain's tendency to downplay risks that seem familiar or routine. We trust what we've always known. We assume that what's around us must be safe, until it isn't. Let's take a real-life example. In the 1970s, a young pediatrician named Dr. Herbert Needleman began testing children's baby teeth for traces of lead. What he found was chilling. Even small levels of exposure were linked to lower IQs, attention issues, and increased delinquency. His findings faced backlash, of course, but they were a turning point. Eventually, public health campaigns and federal regulations caught up. Lead was banned from paint in the United States in 1978. But by then, millions of children had already been exposed, and the effects didn't vanish with the paint. They lingered in bodies, in learning gaps, in entire communities disproportionately affected by environmental neglect. What makes this mistake so disturbing isn't just the scale, it's the silence, the years of not asking, not investigating, not listening, the way the familiar can blind us to harm. And it's not just about lead paint. This kind of assumption creeps into every area of life, technology, medicine, even relationships. When something feels normal, we stop questioning it. We wait for proof instead of heeding early warnings. We choose convenience over curiosity, but curiosity is what saves us. Asking, could this be wrong, doesn't make you paranoid. It makes you responsible. It's what turns silent harm into action, what protects the most vulnerable before the damage is done. Lead paint is no longer on store shelves, but the mindset that allowed it to thrive. That's harder to ban. That takes daily awareness, a willingness to look closer, to challenge what's comfortable, and to speak up when something doesn't sit right. Because sometimes the most dangerous mistakes don't come with alarms. They come with silence and a coat of paint, and the courage to question them is what makes all the difference. A typo in one line of code. That's all it took. The year was 1999, and NASA had just lost a $125 million spacecraft. The reason? One team used metric units, another used imperial. No one caught the mismatch in time. Months of work, years of planning, gone. Not because of a catastrophic failure, but because no one double-checked the math. That's what makes software oversight so unnerving. It's not about villains or sabotage. It's about ordinary people doing complex work, under pressure, with systems that depend on precision. In psychology, there's something called inattentional blindness. It's when the brain, overwhelmed by details, fails to notice the obvious. You're not lazy, you're focused. just not always on the right thing. When engineers stare at thousands of lines of code, it's easy to miss a flaw buried in a familiar pattern. The mind filters out what looks routine, until the routine breaks everything. Take the Thorak 25 radiation machine. In the 1980s, it gave massive overdoses to patients because a software bug allowed operators to input commands too fast. The code couldn't keep up. The result? At least 6 people died. It wasn't malicious, it was human. The developers assumed the hardware safeguards would catch it, but the new design relied too heavily on software, and no one revisited that assumption until it was too late. That's the psychological trap. Once something seems to work, we trust it more than we should. Psychologists call it automation bias. We assume the system is smarter than it is, and that makes us stop questioning even when the stakes are high. This isn't about blaming coders or engineers. It's about recognizing that human cognition has limits. And when systems become more complex than any one person can understand, we need to design for those limits, not ignore them. That might mean more peer reviews, more simulations, more time to think, even when the deadline looms. In high-stakes environments, rushing isn't just risky, it's dangerous. Because oversight doesn't always look like negligence. Sometimes it looks like confidence. And here's the hardest part. The better we get at catching problems, the more invisible they become. Success in software is quiet. The code runs. The launch goes smoothly. The hospital machines work exactly as expected, but it only takes one slip, one unchecked assumption to remind us how fragile that success really is. So the question isn't just, how did this happen? It's, how do we build systems that expect us to miss things? How do we design for human fallibility? Not around it, but with it in mind. Because in the end, the best safeguard isn't smarter machines, it's smarter humility. The kind that doesn't wait for failure to start paying attention. It started with a little red light. At Chicago's O'Hare Airport, 2 planes taxied at the same time, one cleared for takeoff, the other crossing the same runway. Just seconds separated them from disaster. The only reason they didn't collide was because one pilot happened to glance left and slammed on the brakes. The other had already begun to accelerate. This wasn't sabotage or mechanical failure. It was crossed wires, a misheard instruction, and it almost cost hundreds of lives. In aviation, those wires matter more than anything. Every message from tower to cockpit is structured, repeated back, confirmed. There's no room for guesswork. But humans, even in the most regulated environments, still get things wrong. And when they do, the effects can be catastrophic. This isn't about airports, though. It's about the invisible threads we rely on in every system: communication, trust, precision, and how fragile those threads become when stress, fatigue, or assumption creeps in. Because the most disturbing mistakes in history, they rarely start with evil intent. More often, they begin with ordinary moments: a rushed decision, a missed detail, a signal that wasn't heard, or one that was, but too late. Think about 3 Mile Island. The warning signs were there, blinking and buzzing, but overwhelmed operators misread them, thinking it was a glitch, not a meltdown in progress. The same pattern repeats: Challenger, Chernobyl, Bhopal. Highly trained people in highly technical systems making very human errors. Psychologists call it cognitive overload. When our working memory is flooded, we lose the ability to prioritize information. Signals blur, patterns get missed, and our minds start to take shortcuts. And those shortcuts are where the danger lives. Because in a calm room, we'd double check. In a calm room, we'd ask again. But under pressure, we default to what feels right, not always what is right. And sometimes, like those 2 planes on the runway, the consequences are seconds away. What's worse is that our systems often punish caution. There's pressure to move fast, meet quotas, follow protocol without pause. And so people skip the double check. They assume instead of confirm. They choose speed over clarity. But what if clarity was the real safety net? In some industries, they've learned the hard way. Air traffic control now uses structured phraseology that must be repeated back, word for word. In nuclear power, they drill operators not just on procedures, but on how to stop, breathe, and question. Because those small pauses, they can be the difference between routine and disaster. It's not about making no mistakes, it's about building systems that catch the small ones before they become big. Creating cultures where asking twice is wise, not weak. And remembering that every message, every light, every word, every glance carries weight. So the next time you think, they probably know what I meant, ask anyway. When something feels off, say so. And when you're in charge of a system, design it for human error, not against it. Because the most haunting mistakes in history weren't born from villains. They were born from silence, from assumption, from wires crossed quietly and not caught in time. They said the storm wouldn't come. Or maybe they just hoped it wouldn't. The sky had already turned the colour of bruised steel, the air thick with tension that animals sensed before people did. But the evacuation order? Ignored, not because they didn't care, but because they couldn't quite believe it was real. This is the pattern we see again and again, not with bad people, but with human nature. When the stakes are too high, denial can feel safer than panic. And when home is all you've ever known, leaving it behind, even for safety, feels like a loss you're not ready to face. Unheeded evacuation orders often seem like foolishness in hindsight, but from the inside, they're tangled in psychology. There's a term for this, normalcy bias. It's our brain's way of clinging to the familiar, assuming that because nothing terrible has happened before, nothing terrible will happen now. It keeps us calm, but it can also keep us stuck. Think of the man who stayed behind during Katrina, convinced the levees would hold. Or the family during the Paradise fires in California, who delayed until the smoke was too thick to see the road. These weren't reckless people. They were parents, neighbours, everyday decision-makers frozen between conflicting instincts. Protect what you love, and protect who you love. And sometimes those instincts pull in opposite directions. There's also a powerful influence called social proof. If no one else on the street is packing up, it's easy to feel like maybe you're overreacting. People look to others to know how to behave. In disasters, that instinct can delay action just long enough to cost lives. Psychologically, we're wired to belong, to wait and see, but waiting can be fatal when the danger is moving faster than our comfort zone can adapt. And the messaging? It's not always clear. When authorities say, this is a voluntary evacuation, the mind hears optional, maybe even unnecessary. It's only when the word mandatory shows up that urgency cuts through. But by then, for some, it's already too late. Here's the harder truth. Evacuating isn't just a logistical choice, it's an emotional one. You're not just leaving a building, you're leaving photographs, pets, familiar smells, routines. For older adults, it can feel like abandoning a lifetime. For parents, it's the chaos of protecting children in the unknown. For anyone, it's a leap into fear with no guarantee of what's waiting on the other side. So when we hear stories of people who stayed too long, it's easy to judge. But psychologically, it makes sense. The very instincts that help us feel rooted, connected and strong are the ones that can also slow us down in crisis. That's why preparation isn't just about packing a bag. It's about rehearsing the mindset, learning to recognize that moment when hesitation could be deadly. It means teaching people not just what to do, but how to override their own instincts when those instincts might fail them. Because when a warning comes, it's not always the facts that matter most, it's how those facts feel. And unless we prepare for that part too, we'll keep repeating the same mistake. Understanding this doesn't erase the tragedy, but it helps us meet it with empathy. And maybe next time, it helps someone act just in time. Sometimes, the smallest misstep sets off the biggest consequences. Not because it was careless, but because it happened at just the wrong moment, in just the wrong way. A single error, An address written wrong, a message delayed, a decision made on outdated info can spiral into history-shifting results. In the fog of war, this happens more often than we'd like to believe. Take the case of a courier carrying battle plans across enemy lines. He didn't know that the path he chose would lead him straight into capture. And the plans he carried, they fell into enemy hands. What followed wasn't just a lost battle, it was a reshaped front, thousands of lives redirected by one wrong turn. This isn't just about war, it's about the human mind. Under pressure, our brain does something called cognitive narrowing. We zero in on what we think matters most. And in doing so, we sometimes miss what actually matters. We rush, we assume, we act on habit. Not because we're reckless, but because stress tricks us into thinking speed equals clarity. Let's pause on that for a moment, because this isn't just history trivia. It's a window into how we function when the stakes are high, when communication is rushed, when details slip, when one person's oversight becomes everyone's reality. There's a concept in systems psychology called latent conditions. These are the small, unnoticed flaws in a process that seem harmless, until the right chain of events reveals just how much damage they can cause. A mistyped coordinate, a misheard name, a message that sat on a desk just a little too long. On their own, these things seem minor, but in the wrong context, they're dynamite. And ironically, these moments often come from people trying to do their best, trying to deliver, to respond quickly, to keep up with impossible expectations. That courier, he wasn't slacking. He was following orders. The officer who sent him probably didn't think twice. That's how most mistakes unfold, not with negligence, but with urgency. There's something sobering in that, because it means being human isn't just about having great intentions. It's also about how fragile execution can be. It's why pilots run checklists 3 times, why surgeons pause before an incision, why some of the best leaders are the ones who slow down when everything's speeding up. Psychologically, that pause is powerful. It gives the brain space to widen its view again, to shift from tunnel vision back to perspective. In cognitive science, this is linked to metacognition, our ability to reflect on our own thinking. And when pressure rises, metacognition is the first thing to go unless we build in systems that protect it. That's the bigger takeaway here. These aren't just stories of failure. They're reminders that human error is inevitable, but preventable. Not by eliminating pressure, but by designing for it. By understanding that under stress, the brain needs help, structures, habits, pause points to keep things from veering off course. Sometimes one wrong step writes a whole new chapter, but sometimes one small pause prevents it. And knowing the difference is what turns a moment of tension into a moment of clarity, not just in battle plans, but in everyday life too. It started with a tiny drop in pressure, not enough to sound alarms, but just enough to raise eyebrows. On a space station orbiting hundreds of miles above Earth, even the smallest anomaly becomes a question of life and death. Inside that pressurized shell, every screw and seal is meant to hold back the void. There's no margin for error, only vigilance. But humans, even surrounded by the marvel of our greatest engineering, are still very much human. The leak was slow, insidious. A pinhole, barely the size of a grain of sand, hidden behind equipment. It could have come from a micrometeorite, a shift in temperature stress, or, what turned out to be more likely, an accident. A mistake made on Earth, months before the mission even began. A drill bit, pushed just slightly too far during construction, had grazed the hull. Not enough to break it, just enough to weaken it. And once the station was in orbit, that weakness became a ticking clock. This is the hard truth of space travel. Every piece must be perfect, every system redundant. But when people are involved, when real hands tighten bolts and write protocols, imperfection rides along. Not out of carelessness, but because systems this complex are built by people under pressure, under timelines, under budgets. Sometimes that combination creates blind spots. Psychologically, it's tied to a well-known bias. Normalcy. If something didn't cause a problem the first time, we assume it's safe the next. The human brain is wired to look for patterns and minimize threats that seem familiar. That's efficient on Earth. In space, it can be catastrophic. When the leak was finally detected, the crew traced it with patience and precision. Using strips of tape, they monitored where airflow bent ever so slightly. It took hours, days. At one point, they even floated a tea bag, watching how it drifted to isolate the flow. And still, the hardest part wasn't the technical fix. It was admitting that the flaw likely began long before the rocket even launched. That somewhere, a moment of oversight rippled forward into danger. There's a lesson in that. Not just about engineering, but about responsibility. When something goes wrong, we look at who's there to fix it. But just as often, the root lies further back. In a decision made quietly. In a moment where someone assumed it wouldn't matter. And here's the deeper insight. Recognizing this doesn't mean we give in to paranoia. It means we create a culture where questioning is encouraged, not punished. Where checking twice is a strength, not a sign of distrust. Because when you're working in environments where failure isn't just costly but lethal, humility becomes a survival tool. The space station survived, the leak was patched, but the scar it left was invisible, a reminder etched into process reviews and training modules. Some mistakes are loud, others whisper. It's easy to miss the whispers until they scream. But awareness is a kind of airlock. It lets us move from error to insight without letting blame contaminate the process. And in space, as in life, prevention isn't paranoia, it's respect for the systems we build and the people they protect. It starts with a misread. A single line of text, seen through the wrong lens, passed from hand to hand with a growing sense of urgency. By the time it reached decision makers, it wasn't just data. It was a call to act, to retaliate, to prepare for war. And the worst part, it was never meant that way. This isn't fiction. It's the anatomy of a misinterpreted intelligence brief. A quiet error that can echo louder than any explosion. In psychology, there's something called confirmation bias. It's our brain's tendency to notice what fits what we already believe and ignore what doesn't. And in high-stakes environments like military intelligence or diplomacy, this bias doesn't just cloud judgment. It can shape history. A briefing gets scanned, not for accuracy, but for alignment. Does this confirm our fears? Does it support our narrative? If yes, it's believed. If not, it's questioned. There was once a situation where a vague satellite image was interpreted as evidence of nuclear missile deployment. Analysts flagged it. Politicians reacted. Phone calls were made behind closed doors. Troop movements followed. But the grainy image, it showed trucks. Routine, non-military transport. The world came inches from crisis because fear outpaced facts. It's easy to assume that mistakes like these come from incompetence, but often it's the opposite. Skilled, intelligent people under immense pressure, moving fast, trying to prevent catastrophe. That urgency can create a kind of tunnel vision. When every second counts, the brain fills in gaps, especially if those gaps match our worst expectations. This is where psychological research becomes essential. Cognitive load theory explains how stress reduces our ability to process information fully. Under pressure, we don't evaluate, we react. And the more emotionally charged the stakes, the more likely we are to jump to conclusions rather than sit with uncertainty. It happens in smaller ways too. Think of a misread text from a friend that sparked a week of tension, or an email you reread, trying to decode tone that wasn't there. We're wired to interpret quickly, but in doing so, we often interpret wrong. Now imagine that same mechanism operating on a geopolitical scale. One bad read, one flawed assumption, magnified through layers of bureaucracy and fear. A sentence meant as a warning gets read as a threat. A neutral signal becomes a red flag. history bends. So what's the answer? Part of it lies in slowing down, creating systems that allow for second reads, dissenting views, and deliberate pause. In behavioral science, this is called a cognitive forcing function, a deliberate checkpoint to make sure decisions aren't driven by reflex alone. It also means cultivating psychological safety inside high-stakes teams. When people feel they can raise doubts without backlash, better questions get asked. And better questions often lead to better outcomes. Because in the end, it's not just about being right, it's about being clear. About knowing that intelligence isn't truth, it's interpretation. And interpretations are shaped by the minds that make them. One misunderstood message can shift global tides, but one well-timed moment of doubt, that can change the course back. In high-stakes moments, pause isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And sometimes it's the only thing standing between a mistake and a moment that changes the world forever. They called it one of the worst public health failures in modern history. Not because of what nature did, but because of what people didn't do in time. The contaminated blood crisis wasn't a sudden disaster. It was a slow-moving catastrophe built on oversight, silence, and delay. In the 1970s and 80s, blood transfusions and blood-derived treatments were saving lives around the world. But in the background, something deadly had begun to circulate quietly. Viruses like HIV and hepatitis C unknowingly pass through donated blood. And the systems meant to protect people didn't move fast enough. At first, the risk was invisible. There were no reliable tests, no clear warnings, but over time, the pattern emerged. Patients receiving transfusions began falling seriously ill. Haemophiliacs, people who relied on blood-clotting treatments, were especially vulnerable. These treatments, often made by pooling plasma from thousands of donors, became vectors for infection, and the result was devastating. Thousands were infected. Many died. Families were left not only grieving, but questioning why this was allowed to happen. And here's the thing. Some of it might have been preventable. That's what makes it hard to process. Not all mistakes are equal. This wasn't a case of ignorance alone. Evidence mounted. Warnings were raised. Some countries acted faster, screening blood, changing policies, issuing recalls. Others hesitated, weighed costs, avoided panic. And in that hesitation, lives were lost. Psychologically, this kind of event creates a particular kind of wound. It's not just physical harm, it's betrayal. People trusted the system to keep them safe, trusted that the medicines they were given had been carefully vetted. When that trust is broken, it doesn't just shake confidence, it reshapes how people see risk, responsibility, and institutions. In behavioral science, there's a term called normalization of deviance. It describes how risky behavior can become routine when no immediate harm is visible. You cut corners once, nothing happens, so it feels okay to cut again. Over time, the line between safe and unsafe blurs. In the case of blood safety, that normalization, ignoring early warnings, delaying policy shifts, proved fatal. What makes this tragedy so haunting is the scale of its silence. The patients affected weren't part of some fringe case. They were children, parents, everyday people undergoing routine procedures. They weren't asking for miracles, just for care that wouldn't cost them their lives. And yet, from this pain came pressure. Campaigns, inquiries, demands for transparency and justice. The legacy of the contaminated blood crisis forced a reckoning. It reshaped how medical treatments are screened, how policies are made, how quickly systems respond to emerging threats. It sparked changes not just in one country, but globally. It also left a more human lesson in its wake about vigilance, humility, and the cost of delay. When lives are at stake, waiting for perfect certainty isn't always a virtue. Sometimes action under uncertainty is the more responsible path. Mistakes will always happen, but some become warnings. And when those warnings are ignored, they become something far worse. The contaminated blood crisis wasn't just a medical failure, it was a human one. And in remembering it, we're reminded that safety isn't passive, it's active. It demands alertness, accountability, and the courage to act before the damage is done. It started with a design, a system. A brake assembly meant to slow, to protect, to stop. But in one overlooked detail, just one, a catastrophic vulnerability was quietly built in. And no one noticed, not at first. It was the 1970s, and a major car manufacturer was racing to compete in a booming market. They needed a small, affordable vehicle fast. The design was rushed, corners were cut, testing was minimal. But the most devastating choice wasn't about aesthetics or even cost, it was structural. A poorly placed fuel tank, weak rear reinforcement, and brakes that simply couldn't respond quickly enough in a collision. This wasn't just a failure of engineering, it was a failure of responsibility. Psychologically, humans are wired to prioritize immediate rewards over long-term risk. We want to solve the urgent problem, get the product to market, meet the deadline, hit the numbers. But that kind of short-term thinking, when applied to safety, doesn't just increase risk, it multiplies harm. The result? When the car was rear-ended, even at low speeds, the gas tank could rupture. Fires erupted. People were trapped. Lives were lost. And the company knew. Internal memos later revealed cost-benefit analyses weighing the price of fixing the issue against the projected cost of lawsuits. The fix was cheaper, but they didn't implement it. This kind of decision-making reflects something deeper, what psychologists call moral disengagement. It's when people distance themselves from the consequences of their choices by framing them as just business, just procedure, just policy. When you don't see the faces behind the data, it's easier to ignore the weight of what's at stake. But the world didn't stay quiet. Families spoke out. Investigations began. Public trust shattered. And eventually reforms followed. Regulatory standards were strengthened. Whistleblowers found support. The idea that safety could be optional, that changed. Still, the damage couldn't be undone. And that's what makes this story more than a technical failure. It's a human one. A reminder that design is never neutral. Every blueprint carries values. Every shortcut carries risk. And every small decision, especially the ones no one will see, can become the turning point between safety and tragedy. When you design anything that other people will depend on, you're not just building a product, you're shaping lives. That responsibility is silent but heavy. And it doesn't wait for permission to matter. In the end, it wasn't just the brakes that were faulty. It was the mindset, the belief that acceptable risk could be calculated without compassion, that humans could be protected by numbers alone. And that's what changed, forever. Sometimes the greatest losses don't look like ruins or wreckage. They look like silence, a blank space where a voice once lived. And you don't always notice it, because it's absence, not presence, that holds the weight. That's what makes the loss of historical manuscripts so haunting. These weren't just pieces of parchment. They were entire worlds, books, letters, treatises, voices speaking across centuries. Until one day, they weren't. In some cases, the losses were dramatic. Libraries burned, armies looted, natural disasters struck. The Library of Alexandria is the name that echoes most often, an ancient beacon of knowledge reduced to ash. But for every fire, there were quieter disasters too. A scholar's unfinished work, misplaced during war, a forgotten box in a damp cellar, an archive no one bothered to preserve. And then there's something harder to admit. Many of these losses weren't accidents. They were choices. Sometimes made in ignorance, sometimes made with chilling intent. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas, they destroyed vast collections of Mayan codices, not because they didn't recognize their value, but because they feared it. They saw it as dangerous knowledge, tied to a culture they wanted to erase. Only a few texts survived, and with them, just fragments of a whole civilization's thinking, writing, mapping of the stars. Or consider the medieval scribes who scraped off older texts to reuse parchment, unknowingly erasing ancient philosophy or science. These palimpsests tell us what we lost, even as they try to preserve something else. Psychologically, this speaks to our fragile relationship with memory. We often think history is stable, that once something's written down, it lasts. But it doesn't. Not without care, not without people who choose to keep it alive. Because manuscripts aren't immortal. They're physical, vulnerable to fire, flood, time, and human error. The wrong shelf, the wrong assumption, the wrong priority. Even in recent decades, archives have been thrown away to save space. Films stored improperly have disintegrated. Original recordings of music, radio, speeches, gone because someone thought they weren't worth keeping. And yet, in the midst of that loss, there's something quietly heroic about the people who resisted. The librarians who smuggled books out of war zones, the digital archivists painstakingly scanning fragile pages, the scholars decoding faded ink on reused scrolls. They remind us that preservation is a choice, a commitment, a kind of love even. Because saving knowledge isn't just about facts, it's about keeping voices alive, keeping context, keeping the right to understand where we came from and who we could have been. So when we talk about history, we have to remember, we're not hearing the whole story. We're hearing what made it through, what was lucky, what was saved. And that's not just about curiosity, it's about responsibility, because silence isn't neutral. It's the shadow of a decision, sometimes deliberate, sometimes careless, but always consequential. We can't bring back what's gone, but we can protect what's left. And maybe, in that act, we honour not just the words that survived, but the ones that never got the chance. It didn't start with a bang. It started with a bump. $2 billion of military engineering, drifting blind beneath the surface. That's what happened in 2005, when the USS San Francisco, one of the most powerful nuclear submarines in the world, slammed into an undersea mountain at full speed. The impact was immediate. The front of the submarine crumpled like a soda can. Inside, crew members were thrown against bulkheads, injured by the force of their own momentum. One sailor lost his life. Dozens were hurt, and the vessel, meant to be the quiet ghost of the ocean, was suddenly just stuck. But what's striking isn't just the accident, it's how close it came to being something far worse. Because this wasn't just any ship, it was a nuclear-powered submarine, armed with a nuclear reactor. One wrong break, one compromised system, and we're not talking about a dented hull. We're talking about a potential radioactive leak in one of the most fragile ecosystems on Earth. So how does something like this happen? It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't a storm. It was a navigation chart. Or, more accurately, an outdated one. The undersea mountain wasn't marked on the map the crew was using. That's it. That was the missing link. A gap in information. A human oversight, and that tiny error snowballed into a catastrophic impact. Psychologically, this fits a familiar pattern in high-pressure, high-stakes systems. It's often not malice or carelessness that leads to disaster. It's overconfidence in our tools, assumptions, and procedures. It's what's called normalization of deviance. When people get used to cutting corners, or trusting systems that haven't failed yet, it becomes habit. And habits, unchecked, become risks we stop noticing. What makes this story even more sobering is how often the same pattern repeats. From space shuttles to oil rigs to financial systems, it's rarely one big obvious mistake. It's usually a chain of small ones, each one seemingly harmless, until they aren't. And that's what human error really is. It's not just a slip. It's a system failing to account for being human, for tired eyes, for assumptions that go unchallenged, for the pressure to keep going, even when something feels off. But here's the thing. human mistakes aren't always preventable. What is preventable is the environment that lets them spiral. That means questioning what we treat as good enough, updating the maps, even if they've worked before, making space for uncertainty, even in places where we're trained to be confident, especially there, because the lesson of the USS San Francisco isn't just about what went wrong, it's about what didn't. The nuclear core didn't crack. The ocean didn't get poisoned. A tragedy happened, but a greater one was narrowly avoided. And the reason it stayed contained wasn't luck alone. It was the training, the emergency protocols, the quick thinking of a battered but prepared crew. It's a hard truth. Sometimes we learn more from what almost happened than what did. Those are the moments that force us to ask better questions, build better systems. Trust not in infallibility, but in readiness. And maybe that's what progress really is, not perfection, just paying closer attention before the next bump becomes a bang. It wasn't the shaking that caused the most damage. It was the silence before it. In cities equipped with high-tech seismic sensors, alarms are designed to go off seconds before a quake hits. Not minutes, just seconds. But those seconds, they matter. They're the difference between an elevator full of people and an empty one, between kids safely ducking under desks or being caught mid-step in a hallway. So when those warnings don't go off, the consequences echo far beyond the epicenter. One such moment unfolded in Mexico in 2017. The country had a sophisticated early warning system, one of the best in the world. But on the afternoon of September 19th, it failed to sound. People assumed it was a drill, a simulation marking the anniversary of a deadly quake from 32 years earlier. They didn't know history was about to repeat itself. Psychologically, when we're told we'll be warned, we trust the system. We drop our guard. That trust is comforting, but it can also be dangerous, because when alerts go quiet, we freeze, not out of ignorance, but out of disbelief. The mind searches for another explanation, a glitch, a false alarm, anything but the reality of what's happening. And in that pause, those brief moments of hesitation, people lose the chance to act. The science behind early warning systems is complex. It depends on sensor networks, accurate epicenter calculation, rapid data processing, and near-instant communication. Each step has to function perfectly. If one node lags, the whole chain breaks. That's what happened in Japan in 2011. Their system sent alerts, just not to everyone. Coastal towns hit hardest by the tsunami received no advance notice. Some thought the shaking had passed. They didn't know the worst was still on its way. And it's not just the tech. Human error plays a part too. Sometimes warnings are delayed because officials are double-checking, verifying, not wanting to cause panic. But ironically, the delay can do more harm than a false positive ever would. Because panic is recoverable, but inaction when time is ticking down often isn't. There's a deeper lesson here, one that extends far beyond natural disasters. When systems are built to protect us, we tend to outsource our awareness. We assume someone else is watching, that if something's wrong, we'll be told. But in crisis psychology, there's a term called normalcy bias, the tendency to downplay a threat because it doesn't fit with our expectations. When people hear no alarm, they assume no danger. It's not irrational, it's human. The challenge is that systems, whether mechanical or social, are never perfect. And sometimes the price of trusting them too much is paid in lives, not lessons. That's not to say warnings don't work. They do. Every year, countless lives are saved by those precious few seconds of notice. But the failures remind us of something crucial. Alerts aren't just about noise. They're about readiness. They give people time, yes, but only if we're primed to use it. Being alert doesn't mean living in fear. It means remembering that safety isn't something we're given. It's something we help create by staying aware, asking questions, and not assuming silence means safety. Because sometimes the world gives no second chance. only one silent moment. And then the ground moves beneath us.